Hello, my name is Samuel Silbury. I'm a solutions architect here at Nirmata. And today I'm going to talk about how you can use Terraform, Nirmata, and our cluster types to enable DevOps users to create their own clusters. So, if you're going to use the Terraform provider, you're going to need three things. One, you're going to need the Git repo that I've downloaded here, and I will give you the link to the Git repo in the notes for the video. Once you've got this downloaded, you're going to need Go. It needs to be a somewhat recent version of Go. And you're also going to need a fairly recent version of Terraform. So all you need to do is build it. If you're having trouble building it, we could provide you a pre-built binary. You're probably going to want to move it into wherever your platform puts your Terraform plugins. So I put those over there. And then what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to create a Terraform file. We have a bunch of samples that you can use. There's a whole bunch here. The ones that say mine are my own personal ones that I've modified slightly from defaults. So if we look at the GKE sample, and we're going to use GKE because it's simpler, we define four things in here. We're going to define the Nirmata provider. Now, you need to have a functioning Nirmata API key, and I advise that you configure it in the Nirmata token environmental variable. You can set it here. That's not very secure, particularly if you're going to check your Terraform in like all good boys and girls should. If you're not using Nirmata.io, you're using the PE edition, you want to define your URL here, or you can set it in your environmental variable. The nice thing is these variables also work for NCTL. So once we have that, we need a cluster type. Now we can do this in Terraform, or we can use an existing cluster type. So GKE has the fewest number of options here. You just give it a name, you give it a version, you give it credentials, you give it a region. You're going to see all of these in every cluster type that I think we do. And maybe there's one that doesn't use region. In addition, then you've got to do machine type, and oftentimes you'll see a disk size defined here. So if you set all these things up and your credentials exist, this is going to create a cluster type for you. Now, I'm going to go into why I probably wouldn't create a cluster type in Terraform in a little bit, but you must create a cluster type, and you must have a valid cluster type in order to create a cluster. So in order for Terraform to work end to end, we definitely need the ability to be able to create a cluster type. Also, only like somebody with a certain access is going to be able to create a cluster type. Generally, that's going to be your admins, which is another reason why you probably don't want to create a cluster type at this stage. All right, so then you define your cluster. All clusters have the same things that they define. You give them a name, you tell them what type of cluster you want, and you tell them how many nodes you want. And at the very end of this, we define our outputs. Here, we're just going to give us our cluster type name and our cluster name. So what does this look like? Actually, yeah, what does this look like in Nirmata? If we bring up Nirmata here, you can see we have a bunch of clusters here. And then we have cluster types here. So you can see we defined an AKS demo type here. And so you can see here we define a region, resource group, network policy. We can set a subnet ID, all of these things. These are basically required to be able to create an AKS cluster. In addition, you can configure add-ons. So here we've got Caverno and Valero. These add-ons are not necessarily defined by ourselves. We do provide a few, but an add-on can be any Nirmata catalog app, and a catalog app is just a collection of YAMLs. So as long as you've defined a type on it, it'll show up in your, as long as the catalog app has a type defined, it's going to show up in this list. And these can be a whole variety of things. Once you have your cluster type set up, you can create a cluster. So let's go back to Terraform here. So if we run Terraform, and we'll just, actually, I probably need to remove my TF state. Don't do this at home, boys and girls. So I'm going to do Terraform init, and then I'm going to do Terraform apply. So it's going to show me my plan here. This is the creation of the cluster. This is the creation of the cluster type. If we say yes, it's going to go away and do that. In later releases, we're going to poll to see that the cloud provider has actually created the cluster. So what has happened here is we've successfully created the cluster in Nirmata, but it's still being built on the cloud provider side. One of the reasons I'm using GKE is much faster at building clusters. It's also a simpler configuration. So we can see the GKE cluster demo TF is being created. So we can, if we want to, go over here to my AKS one, and you're going to see we've defined this a slightly different way. So we still have the same old provider, but we're not defining a cluster type. So we just give it a name. We give it a type selector, which is that same AKS demo I was showing you, and we say we want to create one node. We've removed the output for cluster type because that would break here. And if we do a Terraform init, Terraform apply, it's going to tell us, okay, you want to create this cluster. We say yes. And then if we go back to Nirmata, navigate away, navigate back, you can see the AKS cluster is being created. We're still waiting on the GKE cluster. Kubernetes clusters take a while. GKE is fast, but it's still going to take you like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Now, I know you're saying this is all well and good, but you're creating these as an administrator. What if I want end users to be able to create my clusters? So if we go over to our DevOps user, you can see we have access to many, many fewer things. In fact, we don't really have access to anything other than our catalog. And, you know, because we don't have a cluster, we don't have any environments we're allowed to. We can see a few image registries, and we can, of course, get our API key. So if we wanted to, we can set this guy up over here. So I've set up my API key in this other terminal. If I do nctl, get clusters, it's going to go, hey, it's cluster get, sorry. We're still not going to be able to see anything. If we did this over in our other environment, we can see all of the clusters. So if we were to go over here into samples, cloud provider, EKS, mine, and we'll do a Terraform init, and we'll do a Terraform create, apply. And it's going to say, okay, you want to apply. So it says, hey, I can't find this EKS demo type. If we look at our EKS configuration here, you can see we've just created an EKS, we've just defined an EKS cluster of this name with this type selector and number of nodes. So this is all valid. There's nothing wrong with it here. If we go in as the administrator and we look on our cluster type policy, we see indeed, yes, there is a cluster type called that. So what was it called? Okay. Demo type. All right. So you can see it here. We defined everything we need to be able to run it. We have one add-on here. But if we go over here, there's no access permissions on here. So administrators can access everything, but end users can't. So if I go over here to user and I find my DevOps user, now you can also, set teams, users, roles, so we could say like the QA team and so on and so forth. So we save that. So we pop back in here where everything failed for us previously. We say yes. Did we not get that? We may have gotten ahead of ourselves here. Let's double check. Unable to find demo type. All right. Okay, we are there. Let's see if we've caught up. There we go. We hadn't caught up. The Nirmata.io hadn't actually caught up that we'd given ourselves access to it. All right. So as a DevOps user, we've created that cluster. If we go back in as a DevOps user, we can now see that cluster. We don't have access to any other clusters because we don't own it or have access. If we go over here to clusters and we look at the EKS cluster and we come over here to settings, you'll see that Sam Flory owns this and has permissions here. If we were to take these permissions away, we'd stop being able to see them. If we wanted to add him here, you can give him view access, environment creation access, editing, admin. If we just give him view, and we pump back over to Firefox. Well, it looks like our AKS cluster's done, but you notice we're stuck on read-only here. So that's Terraform. There's not a lot to it, but if you leverage the pre-existing cluster types when you're doing your Terraform, you can give end users the ability to create clusters. I should also note that now that I've given my DevOps user cluster types, now the add cluster icon is here. I can create EKS clusters because I have that cluster type. If I were to go back over here to policies and go over to my AKS demo and give my DevOps user ability to see that one, it's going to take a little bit for it to realize, yep, there it's there. Just not patient enough. So we can now create AKS clusters with that particular cluster type. So if you give somebody view cluster type access, what you're going to end up with is they are going to have the ability to create clusters. So that's one thing to keep in mind as an administrator. If the permission just says view, but that's the only permission you have, and if they can view this cluster type, they can't necessarily edit it. That's for administrators. They are going to be able to deploy this type of cluster. So If it's an AKS cluster, they're going to be able to deploy an AKS cluster. If it's a GKE cluster, they're going to be able to deploy a GKE cluster. They're going to get the add-ons you've defined. They're going to get the VM types you've defined, disk size and things like that. But they are going to be able to create and manage that cluster. Alrighty. And thank you guys very much, and I will see you next time.